Hey everyone, Steve from Backcountry Gallery here. In the last video, I asked if anyone wanted to see my button and control setup for my Z cameras, and like a lot of you did. So, as promised, here they are. However, before we begin, I think it's important to mention that just because something works well for me and the way I shoot, it doesn't necessarily follow that it will work just as well for you. You see, everyone has different ways of shooting and different priorities when they shoot. So make sure you select the settings and options that allow you to capture the images you want with the least amount of hassle. After all, that's really kind of the point of customizing controls, right? In short, there's not a right or wrong way to do this, so don't feel bad if your settings don't match mine. By the way, if you enjoy these videos, make sure you hit that like button down there and maybe even hit that subscribe button, and definitely hit the notify bell so you know when there's new videos. And of course, let me know what you think about the videos in the comments. It really helps grow the channel, and I really do appreciate your support. Okay, you know what? Enough babble for me. Let's go ahead and hit the menu. Okay, so the first step is to go to the custom setting menu, and you're looking for the controls option here. Give that a click. And then you're looking for custom control assignment if you're shooting a Z6 or Z7. If you're shooting a Z50 though, this is going to say custom controls and then have the word shooting in parentheses. That's the one you want. It leads to pretty much the same menu or the same type of menu. So let me talk about how I have all of these different buttons set. Okay, so let's just go ahead and start at the top here with the FN1 button, and that one is set for spot metering, as you can see here. And basically what spot metering is going to do is it's going to allow me to spot meter wherever my current AF point or AF area is, and it's about a 4mm circle there, and it's going to be centered right in the center of that AF area for you. And obviously in some cases it's going to be a little bit larger than that AF area, like if you're using single point, and in other cases it's going to be smaller, like if you're using one of the wide areas. So that's the area that the camera is going to take the spot meter reading from, and it is associated with that autofocus point. So for example, if you have a composition and you say, hey, I'm going to move the autofocus point to the animal's eye, if you happen to be spot metering, it's going to go ahead and spot meter off of that eye and face area like you see here with the lion. So that's my first one. I have that set to spot metering. Now, a very common question here, though, is can I assign an autofocus area to those function buttons? And if you notice, you just can't, not on this camera. There's only options for like AF on and AF lock, but as of right now, the Z cameras do not allow you to assign an autofocus area like you can on like the D500, the D850, and the D5. Those are basically the only cameras that allow you to assign AF area modes to function buttons. So for right now, I have to pick something else. Since I can't do that, that would be my preferred way, by the way. I would prefer to have an autofocus area on there, but since I can't, I decided to go with spot metering. Give that a click. Next, let's talk about the FN2 button, and mine is assigned to AE lock with the hold option there, and I find that this works really well in conjunction with having the FN1 button set to spot metering, and I'll talk about how I use the two of them together in just a moment here. But first, let's talk about the AE lock options that we have here with our FN2 button. If you notice, there's 3 of them here, and you might be wondering why I'm selecting the AE lock hold. And the easiest way to explain that is to kind of go through what each one of these does very briefly. So AE lock only works like a standard AE lock button. The way it works is you simply press and hold the button if you're in an auto exposure mode, and you just press and hold the assigned button, FN2 in this case, and as long as you're pressing that button, it's going to lock in whatever the exposure was when you press the button. So that's pretty straightforward. When you're done with it, just let go of the button and you're good to go. Metering is normal again. Next, we have kind of an evolution of that with the AE lock reset on release. This works a little bit different. Basically, you just tap the button. You don't have to hold it. And what the camera is going to do is when you tap the button, it will go ahead and lock in that current exposure. And you can focus, you can recompose, you can zoom, whatever you want. And it's going to keep that locked in as long as the camera doesn't turn off or go into standby, or you don't press that AE lock button again. Now, the way this one works is as soon as you take the photo, though, that's when it's going to release the lock and go back to metering as normal. So basically, you get one shot with your AE lock engaged like that. So in my case, that doesn't work too well. I want more than one shot, and that's what the AE lock hold option does. Basically, the way this works is, once again, you just give the assigned button a quick tap. In this case, again, the FN2 button. I just give that a quick tap, and what the camera is going to do is going to lock in that current exposure, and it's not going to release that exposure lock until one of 3 things happens. Either I shut the camera off, the camera goes into standby mode, or I go ahead and just press the FN2 button one more time. Otherwise, it's going to maintain that lock even if I'm shooting. So I can shoot one shot or I can shoot 100 shots. It doesn't matter. It's going to hold that lock until one of those three things happen. Again, the camera shuts off, goes into standby, or you press the FN2 button again. And that is really advantageous when you kind of mix it with spot metering. So let's select that. And let me talk about how I kind of use the two of these together, the FN1 and the FN2 button, why this is such a nice pairing. The reason I like the FN1 and FN2 buttons set up like this is simple. It makes working in the field faster. Most of the time, I use manual with auto ISO, so I'm shooting what is essentially an auto exposure mode. If you want more info on how manual with auto ISO works and why I use it, check out the video linked in the card above. Oh, and by the way, this topic actually does apply to any auto exposure mode, not just manual with auto ISO. When you're in an auto exposure mode, there are times the camera doesn't get the exposure correct. At those times, spot metering a middle toned area in the same light as the subject can really be a lifesaver. In fact, with much of my wildlife photography, I find that simply spot metering on like the eye and face area of most of my subjects will give me a pretty good exposure. Since I like to move my AF point to the eye, and since the metering is linked to that AF area, this works out really well when I run into a situation where matrix metering just isn't getting the job done. However, if I have a subject that's not middle tone, especially if it's like really dark or really light in tonality, the camera is going to over or underexpose that if I just use straight up spot metering. And that's where this AE lock hold option comes in. I can meter off a middle tone area that's in the same light as the subject and then lock in that exposure. Now I can recompose, I can focus, and I can fire away with the correct exposure locked in the entire time. I mean, sure, I could just jump into full manual mode too, but I found that this method is actually far quicker. And actually, I do plan on doing a full video on spot metering techniques in maybe the near future here. By the way, I talk about exposure and metering topics like this in far greater detail in my exposure and metering book for Nikon. If you really want to know how to get the most from your Nikon exposure and metering system, you should join the thousands who have already purchased it and use the advice every time they're out shooting. Anyhow, let's get back to it. So let's go ahead and move on to the next button, which is the AF on button. I have mine set for AF on at the moment because I am using back button focus. However, with mirrorless cameras, I'm not as sure that back button focus is as important as it once was with DSLRs. I have a whole article about that. I'll put it on the card above if you want to read some of my thoughts here, although I am still using back button focus at this time. So this is set to AF on. However, when I do switch over sometimes to use front button focus, depending on the situation, I will switch this to AF lock only, with a little bit of irony there, making my AF on button an AF lock button. But most of the time, especially since I'm using back button focus, I have that set to AF on. Next we have the Sub-selector, which is just basically the joystick, and this is what happens when you wiggle it, basically. And right now it's set to focus point selection. There's some options where you can do some stuff as far as setting it the same as the multi-selector, and there's some other options there too, but for the most part I think focus point selection is probably the smartest thing to do with this, so I'm going to leave that one at the default and leave it alone. Let's move on to the next one, which is actually what happens when we press the joystick, when you push it in. And right now it says reset, and basically what that's going to do is it's going to select the center focus point. And the reason I have it set like this is because I figure, you know what, if I'm manipulating my autofocus points with the joystick, which is exactly how I do it. I don't use the multi-selector for that. So if I'm doing that, I might as well have this set up so that if I need to get it back to center in a hurry, which can happen sometimes you are not really paying attention, maybe you rub up against the joystick and the AF point gets in the wrong spot. If you need to just get it back to center in a hurry, it's really nice to have it set like this. Just one quick press and it's there. So that's how I have that one set. Very handy, and I have found that very useful. Next we have the movie record button, and I've actually set my focus mode and AF area mode to that button. I find that very handy. I love that position. By default, you can do this with the FN2 button. That's how it's set from the factory. However, I find the position of the FN2 button isn't really convenient. I don't really like where that is positioned on the camera, at least not for me. So I like to assign something there that I don't have to like manipulate that much. So that's why that AE lock hold is on there. But one of the things I do manipulate a lot is my AF area mode. So I want to have a really convenient way to do that. So by putting that on the record button, all I have to do then is press that record button. And you know what? When I'm shooting, my finger is like right next to it. So all I have to do is press that record button and turn the front command dial, the sub command dial, and that will change the AF area mode. If I press and hold that button down as I'm turning the rear command dial, the main command dial, it'll actually change my focus mode from like AFS to AFC to manual mode. So I find that very handy. In fact, I highly recommend you at least give this a try. It's really, really nice to have it on the movie record button. I find that it's way easier to manipulate, at least for me, than it is in other places. So I definitely recommend it. The only downside is if you do a lot of filming. Of course, if you flip to regular movie mode, what's going to happen is when you press that movie record button, it's going to start recording movie. You won't be able to actually switch your AF modes anymore, and you'll have to like resort to the I menu for that. But I don't do a lot of filming, so for me, this works out really, really well. Okay, next we have our lens function button, and I have mine set to subject tracking. Now, this is not available on the Z50, but if you have a Z6 or Z7 with the current firmware 3.0 at the time of this recording, if you have a Z6 or Z7, you can actually assign tracking mode to some of your buttons here, the FN1, FN2 button, and the lens function button. I have mine on the lens function button, and it's really handy. If I'm in the auto AF area, I can just go ahead and press the lens function button. And interestingly, this also works on adapted lenses. So if I have my 500 PF on there and I'm in the AEL mode on the little memory recall switch, I can actually go ahead and press one of those buttons and it will initiate subject tracking if I'm in the auto AF area. So I really like that on the lens, and most of the lenses I use have function buttons, so I decided to put it there. I don't use the auto AF area with subject tracking very often, so I don't really need that button on the camera. And if I am going to use it, I'm probably going to have a longer lens that is going to feature those lens function buttons. So I do have subject tracking there. Now, the lens function button number 2, I don't currently own any lenses that have a second lens function button on them. And I hope to one of these days if the 70-200S ever comes into stock someplace, but right now I only have the one lens function button. And finally, we come to our lens control ring. Now, every Nikon Z series lens, every Z mount lens is going to have a lens control ring on it. And that lens control ring on a lot of lenses is typically used for focus. Now, some lenses are going to actually have a lens control ring and a separate focus ring. My 24-7-28, for example, has a focus ring on the front and has a lens control ring on the back. So in a situation where you have both a lens control ring and a focus ring, the lens control ring by default is set for aperture, but I changed mine to exposure compensation, which is really, really handy. There is nothing better than using that for exposure compensation. I always hated pressing that little tiny button in and then trying to manipulate the dials while I'm trying to shoot. It seems like it takes too long. This is very intuitive. It is very, very fast. You can whip from minus to +5 stops of exposure compensation in like a half a second if you want to. So very, very handy. Now, if you do have a lens or lenses that only have the lens control ring and no focus ring, you could still go in here and set that control ring for exposure compensation. Now, of course, you lose the ability to manually focus, but you know what? If you don't manually focus very often or never, maybe this is a pretty good trade. So this is something you'll have to decide. Now, of course, you can always jump back in here. It's not that hard to set this back to focus if the need should arise. But anyhow, that's how I have mine set for at least my 2470 here, because I think that works really well. Now, there's one customization I like to do that is outside of this particular menu. So let's go ahead and back out to the controls area and go down to the OK button. Give that a click. And under shooting mode, I like to set this for zoom on and off, and I like to have it at 100%. There's some options for low and high magnification, but low magnification doesn't seem to give me enough magnification, and high magnification is kind of oversampled, so 1:1 seems to work really well. Now I'm just going to hit the OK button there, and the reason I like to do that is because it allows me to press the OK button while I'm shooting and zoom into the image at 100% by the AF point. Makes it very easy if I want to either verify focus or if I'm manually focusing. And this is something I used to do and recommend with DSLRs for the live view feature. Most of the time I would have my OK button set so that one press I could zoom into 100% when I was using live view, so it was a natural transition when I moved to the Z cameras to go ahead and turn that on for them as well. So as you're shooting, just press OK and you'll zoom right in there. You'll have to give that a try. It's pretty cool. Now, another option here, just to make sure you have it set, is to go back in here and in playback mode, just make sure that zoom is on or off and that you're at 1:1 100% again for the same reasons. And what this is going to do is when you hit the play button on the back of your camera, you can just press that OK button to zoom into the image at 100%. That is a very, very handy way to check focus very rapidly in the field. And I believe the Z cameras are set up like that by default, but just in case, you might want to double check it. So there you go, all of my control settings. Keep in mind that while these are sort of my default settings, I do swap them around and I change them up when I'm in the field if I need to. Remember, just because you assign a function to a button, it doesn't mean it has to be permanent. Ideally, you should select settings that you need to change fast and frequently, and maybe just leave the rest to that iMenu area. And that might be a topic we discuss in another video. Also, if you enjoyed these tips, make sure you watch for my upcoming book on the Z Series AF system. It's now over 460 pages of advice that'll help you get every ounce of performance from the Z Series AF system, and you can look for that sometime June 2020. And of course, check out my other books and video workshops as well. Hundreds of pages and hours upon hours of videos full of tips, tricks, and advice. Finally, make sure you sign up for my free email newsletter so you'll know when that book launches. Plus, you'll never miss a video, an article, or a workshop opportunity. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day.